The council commissioned the design of Park Hill and built it, and the council's work department poured the concrete on site and built it. It took 4 years to build. And the council wanted to do something very dramatic in terms of post-war affordable housing, providing for the people of Sheffield, and they wanted to do something to replace the slum conditions that were on that hill just below the station. And people were living in really bad housing conditions. I imagine you've seen that in pictures. And so they were very keen that Park Hill would be a way forward for people for urban living. So they, council's architects department designed it. They went on a visit out to Le Corbusier's Unit A. And originally Park Hill was designed not to be built on this site actually, but further up the hill at Norfolk Park. Actually the government changed the rules on subsidy, which meant that it was better for the council to build it here. And it works better here actually because of its location and because of the hill. That was its role in the first place. I think it's very difficult to say. I mean, the idea that you have a community that all love each other and go to the seaside, send all the kids to the seaside, and is nostalgia. But there are communities that do a lot more things together and feel comfortable and know their neighbours and look after each other, even if they don't do it in a very open and active way. It's actually that's the bottom line. That's the ethic of where they live. And I think you can get that back. I think you get that back in places people love to live.
Yeah.
I mean, people will live in the worst lousy housing conditions in order to be in a certain place, and yet they can be in lovely housing conditions in an awful place, and they've got no affinity with it. So I think people who will come here to live will want to be here and will feel proud of being in Park Hill, and will enjoy the kind of living, the way of living. Some people would never like it. I mean, there's a lot of other issues about, people's risk assessments. About, people would let their kids come out here and play in the old days, and they probably don't do that now. I wouldn't let my kids go out and play when they were little, when I couldn't see them. So there's lots of changes in society that mean that things wouldn't be done the same way. But I think there are elements you can bring out of the community for the future that would work. I think the invention of the disposable nappy didn't help, because we had the Garchie system here where people just put everything down the sink. It was mashed up, and that was ruined by the nappy. Unemployment meant that the balance of people who were economic, as it did in most of Sheffield, but here in a close-knit community, suddenly your community has changed a lot. And also people aspired often to have a house. They were seeing new housing being built in different parts of the city, so if you wanted a house, we couldn't help you here because there were only flats. There's some 3-bedroom flats, so it's fine, but people were looking for their house with a garden. So some people started moving away, and it meant that it became more difficult to let some of the flats, especially at this end, which meant that they went to people who didn't particularly want to be here. Whereas at the other end, people would ask for that, and therefore they're interested in being here. But people who come and live in a flat, they're not bothered, or they leave after 9 months or whatever, the turnover is very high. You start getting this feeling of abandonment. It never was really felt completely abandoned here, like it did in some other parts of Sheffield. But you started getting people who didn't have an interest and didn't feel part of the community. And so you end up with some more antisocial behaviour, perhaps some criminal activities, as I say, often linked with things going off in the city as well. And generally, people may have talked to you about the bus outings they used to have to the seaside and all that kind of thing, and that whole, communities going off and doing that kind of thing wasn't happening so much. People were staying inside and watching the telly. But sometimes something as simple as that. They didn't speak to their neighbours as often as they would have done in the past. And so the concept began to be more difficult to sustain when you had a community that actually became largely economically inactive. we supported the listing.
Yeah.
The listing, I think, was promoted, and I wasn't there at the time, but I think was promoted by the 20th Century Society. English Heritage had always had an interest in Park Hill, and we had 4 schemes like this in the city, deck access housing on a massive scale. Two of which we've knocked down. One Hyde Park behind here, we were in the process of looking for a solution for, and had demolished the biggest block. And so a lot of architects were saying this shouldn't happen to Park Hill. We had to find a solution. We had 1,000 council tenancies here, with the building, going through a range of cycles of maintenance, and us not being able to afford to do a lot of the repairs and improvements to it. We spent about 15 million over the years on Park Hill and capital improvements, but something this scale requires an awful lot more.
Yeah.
So we did support the listing because, well, some people think we would have got some money for doing that, but I'm not sure we were that naive. We know there's not a lot of money around for listed buildings, but I think it was to mark how special it was,
yeah.
and knowing that it was something that Sheffield did and was very proud of, even though some people don't like it. Actually, as a social housing scheme, the largest social housing scheme post-war in Britain, we were proud of that. So we wanted to find a solution, but we also wanted to celebrate the quality of the architecture, and the whole community thing was really important as well. We've done lots of talking with residents, and they wanted to stay as a community, as you heard yourself today. Well, I think it's a bit of both. I think architects pushed in the way that they would, through the societies and pressure groups that they would know, and also there was an awful lot of work in architectural journals promoting Park Hill. For the people living here, they just know they like it, and they didn't want to go, and they had this long history and sense of community. They were uncomfortable with what was happening to Park Hill over the years, and that their society was sort of changing, but the whole of society was changing, and they sort of understand that. When the jobs sort of got ripped away from Sheffield in the 80s, a lot of people here who would have been employed were not employed anymore, and so lots of things were changing. But local people did want to protect it, a lot of people here. But they probably expressed that in a different way than architects might have done. Local councils, the Labour Council, were very keen to protect it because they knew it was a legacy of Labour post-war. I mean, it's a good scheme in terms of where it is, I think. The whole deck access living may not work in different places. It worked here particularly because each of the decks, as you probably gathered, comes down and hits ground floor level because of the hill. So apart from the top floor, you can actually access every deck from the ground, which means that people don't feel quite as cut off away, and they kind of work with the ground much more than they would do in another deck access. And the proximity to the city centre, again, meant it was very popular. So Park Hill, in terms of housing management, it wasn't ever a major problem in the sense of we couldn't let it in the early days. It got to the point where the north end of it was more difficult to let. But it was never on the scale of problems that we had with other housing in Sheffield, where we had sort of abandonment of council housing.